Hi everyone, I'm back with another film, and this time it's The Favourite by Yorgos Lanthimos. So we're going to do our usual thing. Should you see it? Should you see it in the cinema? B, then I'll talk about the film, and then we'll have a break for spoilers. And also in spoilers, I'll talk about the difference between the film and the history of this queen. Because she did exist. This wasn't a fictional story. There was a real Queen Anne. There was a real Sarah Churchill and Abigail Hill. So we'll cover all that. Now, should you go see it? I think you should definitely go see it. This is the most accessible of all Lanthimos' films. And it's got a lot of Oscar buzz. It's got BAFTA nominations. It's even picked up a couple of early awards. And so if you're into film, it's the kind of film which people will be talking about. Secondly, I just think it's very different to a lot of films that are out these times. And the rule of thumb I'll use is if you loved a film called Dangerous Liaisons, then you will love this film. It's got that same cutting edge war of words rather than using violence. It's all about witty put downs and how you can show your dominance. So look, we'll be back in a second and let's talk about this film. Okay, so let's discuss this film. So a couple of ways you could cut this cake up, but let's start with Yorgos Lanthimos. So he is, I think, one of the most interesting filmmakers working right now. I haven't seen his really earlier work. I haven't seen Dogtooth, but I loved The Lobster, Killing of a Sacred Deer, and now he's done The Favourite. Now, the interesting thing is the first film that he has not co-written. He has a regular writing partner. And this was based on, I believe, a book, which was then adapted, and then he put his stamp on it. And I think that's done an interesting thing. He's writing a much more, he's working with much more accessible material. It's a historical drama, it's a costume piece, it's got great actors, but then he puts his little weird stamp on it. And that probably elevates what might have been just regular material in anyone else's hands. I think the thing about this is it's really opened this up to getting critical acclaim as well as good audience reaction. Then you've got to talk about, this is just an acting showcase because you've got three main female leads and they all just go for it. So you have Queen Anne, played by Olivia Colman, Sarah Churchill, that Churchill, and she's played by Rachel Weisz, and then you have Abigail Hill, played by Emma Stone. So you've got three, heavy hitters who all bring their A game. And I think whoever you think outshines the others, it all goes on where your sympathy lays. Because when I've talked about this film with other people, some people will love Queen Anne, some will love Sarah Churchill, and some will love Abigail Hill. And it all depends on which character you are most sympathetic to. Then you think they were the best actress. I think it's very interestingly shot because I think very early on it is very clear that your sympathy should lie with Abigail Hill, and then it twists and turns throughout the film. Whereas all my sympathy lay with Sarah Churchill, who is a little bit more similar in my personality, I guess. And so I just linked up with her. But Olivia Colman probably has the hardest job to do. She really has to open herself up as this incredibly vulnerable person. She's sick all the time. She has ongoing psychological and health issues. She's had 17 children who have not survived into adulthood. All those are true things. And Olivia Colman is done no favors because Lanthimos shoots this film in a very strange way. So, if you were shooting this film in a normal way, you would have a lot of close-ups. There are hardly any close-ups. So when he goes to a close-up, it's really a bit of a shock, and that's what he's doing. He really wants you to look at that face. He does a couple on Emma Stone where you really can see what she's crafting for that situation. The other thing he does is he uses fisheye lens a lot, which, I mean, I can't even think of anyone else who uses fisheye lens. Almost looks like it's on a GoPro, which I can't imagine it was, and I did not like that. I don't think that helped the film, especially since it's set in the 1700s. The other thing he does is, which you really never see, it's kind of like breaks a bit of a rule. He shoots upward from the ground so that people are seen at an angle and it kind of goes through their chin, and you see the ceiling often, and because it's a period piece, kind of the ceilings are quite interesting, but again, you wouldn't do that normally in a modern film, and it really is not a flattering look, and especially for Olivia Colman. I mean, she's obviously put on a little bit of weight for the role, and it's really like this huge chin, but even like, you know, Emma Stone and Rachel Weisz is just so gorgeous, and they on occasion do not look great. Rachel Weisz just looks stunning always, but he doesn't always shoot them in the most flattering way. So you have this interesting take on this story, which is real, but then they've added in these dramatic elements, and it all mixes together in this interesting soup. Now, I just want to mention that one of the people who steals every scene they're in is Nicholas Hoult, who plays Harley. Now, Harley was a real guy and was the leader of the Whigs, I believe, but I could have that wrong. It's the Whigs and the Tories, and I always get them mixed up. But for the purposes of the film, he's the leader of the opposition, and he's trying to wrest back control and end the war. And this is all I should add. This is 1708, give or take. Although certain events have probably been moved around a little bit, this is all real stuff. There was a real Harley guy, but he was like 50 years old or something. He wasn't beautiful like Nicholas Hoult. But every line which comes out of Holt's mouth is just a bit decadent, bit horrible, and very witty. And that's the other thing I wanted to talk about in this film is it is very bawdy. Now, if you think of the word bawdy, you don't often think of films being bawdy now. The last film that I can really think is probably Kubrick's Tom Jones. And before that, when I was a kid, you'd have like the Carry On films and all that. And I was trying to think, what does bawdy mean? And it's where there's a lot of licentiousness. It's very luxuriant, and obviously very sexual. But the reason it works is the men and the women are equal. You don't, like in a bawdy film, there's not often the use of male violence or power. The men and the women, they can be very physically rough, but the woman is just as rough as the man. And they're both also, the other thing about being bawdy is everyone knows it's sexual. So you often swear or you often are referring to the act, but in a way in which no one's offended. So that happens a lot in this film. There's a lot of swearing. It's rated MA 15+ in Australia, and I think, unfortunately, I think you probably got to take probably a teenager, could go and see the film, but they would have to be a bit worldly, because as I said, a lot of swearing. There's a few sex acts, but they're very tastefully done. But again, like if you had a naive teen, it'd probably be a bit too much for them. So, look, we've discussed a lot. I'm going to come back in spoilers so then I can talk clearly, and I'm going to explain the ending, which I think has mystified a few people. Okay, bye. Okay, but before I start telling you about the ending, let's just talk quickly historically. Like, this film is very strange. So the first thing you've got to talk about is the anachronisms in it. So normally I do a thing where I go, this is the best scene of the film, and there are a lot of scenes I like, but the best thing I liked about this film were the costumes. But the costumes weren't from the 1700s. They were very odd. And in fact, there's an outfit that Rachel Weisz wears as Sarah Churchill after she's been disfigured, which is almost like out of anime. I mean, it just looks great, but all the outfits are brilliant. This is going to win the Best Costume Award for sure. and I really enjoyed that it just had this completely different look. And the dances are so odd. And you're kind of not sure if they're like in Queen Anne's head or if Lanthimos is just having a bit of a joke, that we don't know how strange these dances were, and somehow everyone knows all these ridiculous steps. It was a lot of fun. So let's look. Historically, there was a Queen Anne, and Sarah Churchill was a real person. Abigail Hill was a real person. Now, Sarah Churchill wrote a memoir after being dismissed by Queen Anne, which happens in the film, and she was the one who set basically in stone this view of Queen Anne as this uneducated person, which was true, and really had no education. She was brought up by a parson, and the reason being, I'm not going to get into you, there's whole books on this, but she wasn't ever really meant to become queen. Quite a few people had to die in a very short time. She was married to King George. Now, King George was alive during this whole film, and they don't show him because kind of would derail what they're trying to say. But yeah, he was in the background. She was also known as very religious and very much a prude. So this whole thing about her having these love affairs, and lesbian love affairs at that, is very controversial. But it is true that Sarah Churchill threatened her with showing her letters, which could have been interpreted as meaning more than platonic love and maybe some sort of sexual relationship. So that part is true. And Abigail Hill did rise, and as Sarah Churchill went down, and did become, for a little while, the second person to the Queen. She was actually cousins in real life to Harley, so it was a lot more political rather than the way they made it a lot more personal. But all those characters did exist, and a lot of this stuff happened, but and the 17 children did occur. But the thing about the poisoning and all that was made up just to give it a bit of dramatic flair. Now let's talk about the main thing, the ending, which has thrown quite a few people and is a very Lynchian kind of ending. But I think that ending makes the film. And that is, right at the end of the film, Sarah Churchill has left. Her letter never got through. And if I did have to talk about a great scene, it's that scene where Emma Stone, Abigail Hill, reads the letter, and she sheds a tear, but then burns it, knowing that with that act, Sarah Churchill will never come back. And what, interestingly, you can interpret that as, is the letter so beautiful in her love for Queen Anne, or is it that though she knows she's snookering her competition, that there's a little bit of her which still feels for her cousin, and that, you know, what she's doing is not the right thing. I'm not sure, but it's a beautiful scene. So soon after that, Abigail Hill gains ascendancy and then falls into the trap of really indulging herself to a degree which really all the aristocracy have been doing. All through the film they show the indulgence of the aristocracy compared to the sacrifices being made by the working people, and they even talk about how they're not getting food and how the troops are being killed in France. So they have this scene where just before it, Abigail Hill squashes one of the rabbits, which represent, you know, children or grief. And what she does is she squashes that rabbit to such a degree that it starts urinating and crying out. And the Queen hears it, and all the scales fall from her eyes. She now knows that she has gotten rid of maybe the true but overly honest Sarah Churchill, who did seem to have her best wishes at heart and would stop her from indulging and eating certain things which gave her gout. For this monster, Abigail Hill, who lets her do anything because she doesn't really care about her to the same degree. And at that point, something flips, and they have a scene in which she gets out of the bed and she's can't hardly move, and she says, rub my legs, which has been kind of like a code in the past for rubbing her legs to get relief from her diseases, but also linked to sexual pleasure, especially if she was in the bed or something like that. And then what occurs is, as that is happening, she starts to really rub Abigail Hill's head in a manner which is not pleasurable to either person, and it's showing dominance. And really what they're saying is, you might have everything you want, but you're still a servant, and I'm the queen, and I now know what is happening, and this is your hell, that you can be in this position of high status, but you're just a servant. And then what happens is, as only Lantinos would, he starts overlaying the screen with the rabbits. Now the rabbits have each been named for one of the children which didn't make it to adulthood. So they represent grief, they represent trying to, give yourself a small thing in compensation for a large thing. But the main thing is, those rabbits are pets. Abigail Hill realizes that she is in hell, that really she is not a baroness, but while she works for Queen Anne, she is a rabbit. She's a pet. And that face that she pulls as she realizes the hell that she made, that she wanted, and Queen Anne is in a similar hell because she has rejected the friend who is a true friend, even though they might have sparred a lot, for this creature. It's really an interesting way to end a film which has been in a lot of ways quite straightforward narratively. The Lantinos just has to put that in there. So look, it's a really interesting film. I think everyone should see it, and especially if you're interested in the award season. So that's it for today. As I said, a million films coming because I've got to see all the films which will be in the hunt for the awards. If you like what I'm doing, press like, subscribe, hit the bell, then you'll always know when I've got new stuff coming. And it's coming up probably more than weekly at the moment. And I'm on Twitter at Guru Eden. So I'll talk to you then. Okay, bye.